up ahead. And good morning to our online participants as well, or good afternoon or good evening. It's a good reminder. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So please join me in welcoming to the floor our head of office, Mr. Gerard de Graaf.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Isabel. I think there's a particular place I have to stand. Is that here because of the online? I can't move. I've been told I can't move. I just have to stand still all the time here. But good morning. It's great to see such a huge turnout. I mean, sorry, maybe a bit for the people in the back that we don't have any more chairs, but I mean, you have coffee and there's food, so I'm sure you're well served. Welcome. This is the 22nd Brussels to the Bay since we started some 3 years ago. So it's exciting to see that it's still a success and people come out on a Friday morning to join us. This time on AI. We've had several on AI, but we can't get enough of AI, so we continue to put these events up. I mean, on building, governing the AI frontier. And I mean, I never start with regulation whenever I give a presentation here in the US or in Silicon Valley. I deliberately not start with like the governance and the EU AI Act, because, you know, there's the perception and sometimes the prejudice here in the US that the only thing that the European Union cares about is to regulate technology, and then by implication, because regulation stifles innovation, there is no innovation in the European Union. So my start is always about the innovation side, like what are we doing actually to promote AI in the European Union, because we want, and maybe in the title, so building and governing the AI frontier, we want to take advantage of AI. We want to take advantage of the AI frontier. And so how are we trying to do that in the European Union? And we'll come to regulation. We see regulation as a part of it. We think actually regulation is important because of the predictability, because of the trust. And so it's a part of like making innovation work in the European Union and around the world. So we don't agree with this like thesis that somehow regulation is bad for innovation. Bad regulation is bad for innovation. Good regulation is good for innovation. But in terms of like what do we do in the European Union to promote innovation, it's a couple of things. Actually, interestingly, next week the European Commission will bring out a strategy called Apply AI. And so very much driven by the need and the desire to make sure that AI is adopted, because it's good to have AI, but if it is not adopted in our industries, in healthcare or in energy or in agriculture, manufacturing, logistics, I mean, there's not much point, because we do see the benefits. I mean, exciting potential in healthcare. I mean, fantastic like breakthroughs are possible also in science. We can't achieve our ambitions in climate change without AI. We need smart grids, for example, and so AI is absolutely indispensable to achieving European Union's objectives. And particularly, of course, when you're focused or you're faced with like populism, and we need to show that AI can bring benefits. We can maintain our very high standard of living in the European Union, and we kind make sure that people are prepared for the changes that are coming. So there's a lot at stake, and so the Apply AI strategy is part of that. We also had, these kind of things don't get as much noticed as like the EU AI Act, but we had an AI continent action plan a couple of months ago. And I mean, there's a plan. Sometimes you see documents coming out of the EU and then you wonder like, what's the strategy, what's the plan, even though it says strategy or plan on the front page of it. But here there is a real plan, which is to build a network of AI factories or gigafactories. And these consist of extremely powerful supercomputing capacities. We have now 12 AI factories around the European Union. We are now turning some of them into gigafactories, so even more powerful. I mean, these kind of supercomputers, and we are back. I mean, the European Union was out of the top 10 of fastest supercomputers in the world. We're back in the top 10 with 3 of the 10 supercomputers in the world. And so they are going to be loaded with, like, NVIDIA is very happy about it, with NVIDIA GPUs. And with these supercomputers, we're also creating data spaces, for example, around health and energy, and agriculture. So to bring lots of data together, there's a lot of data in the European Union, but it's fragmented, it's dispersed. We need to bring it together. We have AI Excellence Center, so that like if you need some help, if you're an SME, you need some help. How do I use AI? How can I kind of make the most of it? What do I need to do to my business model? There are 160 plus centers across the European Union to help. We have the open source models, we have support on algorithms. And if you create such a network of gigafactories, and we had a call open for gigafactories until like June, I mean, we had expected maybe 15 expressions of interest. We got 76. And these are public-private partnerships. So, I mean, business, governments, I mean, universities coming together. I mean, and so what we're telling these 76 now, representing about 14, 15 member states, is get together, consolidate. And then we'll do a call kind of before the end of this year. And then we will start identifying and selecting these gigafactories. And there's, of course, a major financial contribution of the European Union as well. And if you open these gigafactories up and you allow like startups and research and universities and kind of centers to access those capacities, then you're going to see a lot of innovation. And so, for example, when you talk about like, are there AI companies in the European Union? There are 7,900 AI startups now in the European Union and counting. And I was personally surprised. I mean, the Financial Times, I think earlier this week or end of last week, I mean, had front page Black Forest Labs. I mean, valued at €4 billion valuation with investors. Well, I mean, Black Forest Labs, I mean, the Black Forest, a beautiful area in Germany, Rhineland-Pfalz. I mean, in Freiburg is where, I mean, I had never heard of Black Forest Labs, frankly. I mean, maybe to my disgrace. But so there is this type of potential in the European Union. There are very exciting AIs. There's a lot of like venture capital now moving in also because there's investment, not only in these AI gigafactories, but also like in defense and security and infrastructure in general. So there's a new wind blowing, and like in 2 weeks' time, we do another Brussels to the Bay about like the investment climate in the European Union, the startups, like what's happening. I mean, how vibrant is the European Union, and so what does it mean in terms of innovation? So that's what I talk about when I talk about AI. And then, of course, I also talk a bit about the governance side. I mean, we've passed the rulemaking stage. We have done a lot of rulemaking. The previous commission, when I was still in Brussels, I mean, I worked on DSA and DMA, so I'm a part of the EU censorship team, I guess. But we did a lot of rulemaking. This commission, far less. I mean, there's going to be some rulemaking, but the name of the game is really making it work. The name of the game is also simplification. Maybe in some areas we've gone a little bit too far, particularly in terms of administrative burdens, particularly for smaller companies. So there is an exercise going on simplification. There is what we call a digital omnibus bill in the works, which should come out next month. And so, I mean, when I talk here to people, say, European Union is so overregulated. I say, well, great, thank you so much for kind of, and now give us some examples where you think the EU is overregulated. And the ones that are kind of have the strongest views about EU overregulation are always the most silent when it comes to like, well, give me some practical examples. But if you have suggestions where the EU can simplify, there's a public consultation open for another 10 days. And so we're really looking for input so that we can actually come forward with some meaningful simplification before the end of the year. So that's like on the governance side. Well, you have probably all heard of the Code of Practice. This is like, it's an interesting process, and we are very honored to have like a chair, a vice chair of the different groups that put the Code of Practice together. But the Code of Practice was co-created by more than 1,000 experts across very different areas. And so this is not something where a couple of like officials or bureaucrats, as they sometimes are called, or Eurocrats are sitting in a room and put together what they think is the right approach. No, this is really kind of the community coming together and on the basis of the principles in the EU AI Act, kind of coming forward with something that's like both operational and evidence-based. So we actually want to kind of, so I said, I don't start with the regulation, we start with the innovation side of things, but now I think it's useful because we are honored also to have our colleague Lauro Langasco here from Brussels. He's still jet-lagged, came in yesterday. He is part of the AI team, the AI office in Brussels. And so what we suggest first, before we then hand over back to Isabel, and she will introduce a brilliant panel that we have this morning, that Lauro is going to take us through the code of practice, which, I mean, we believe could become like a global standard. If you look also in this country, there are major developments. AI action plan, of course, we saw a few months ago. I mean, this week, Governor Newsom signed SB 53, authored by State Senator Wiener. An interesting, very interesting bill. I mean, we've worked and talked a lot with Senator Wiener over the last couple of months, of course, also before with 1047 that the governor vetoed. So there's a lot going on in this space, and I think there's therefore also much to discuss. But the code of practice could become something, and 30 companies, many of them here in San Francisco, actually, or in the Bay Area, signed up to the code of practice, could become some kind of global framework that certainly will inspire other jurisdictions and countries around the world. So I'm going to give the word now to Lauro. He's going to take us through the highlights of the code of practice, probably 10 or 15 minutes, and then maybe there's time for a few questions, and then we just dive in and go to the panel. I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you.
Here's the spot. Thanks, Gerard, for the introduction and also for having me here. I'm very glad to be here. I'm Lauro Langasco. I work for the AI office. Specifically, I work for the team that is responsible for implementing and enforcing the laws on frontier AI models. My background is in machine learning, so I am more on the technical side. So these are questions like, what are appropriate evaluations? What are good safety mitigations? That sort of thing. So I'm going to touch on quickly two things, both of them already mentioned by Gerard. The first is, maybe you can, So the first is our strategy to promote AI uptake in Europe and also support technological progress in general. So this I'll go through briefly because Gerard already touched on it. Like you mentioned, there are two key documents or strategies that we put out here. One of them is the AI Continent Action Plan, which came out in April. And the other one will come out next week on Tuesday. So that's the Apply AI strategy. So stay tuned for that. The AI Continent Action Plan has 5 key pillars. The central focus is compute. So here the Commission is funding, and also in collaboration with private actors, data centers all over Europe. Then there is data. So here the idea is to support and enable data within sectors to be gathered and federated so that it can be used for training AI models. Then, of course, another key pillar is adoption and skills. So basically helping companies to apply AI in their work, and also regulatory simplification. So it's decreasing the regulatory burden, and also things like making sure there is a consistent application of rules throughout all of the member states. So there's less fragmentation. So that's the AI Continent Action Plan. I can say less about the Apply AI strategy since it's not out yet, but it will build on the AI measures in the AI Continent Action Plan to support companies in their adoption of AI. Now we can move on to the next slide. Thanks. So now I want to talk a little bit about the rules on frontier AI models, and specifically the General Purpose AI Code of Practice, which is a document and a tool for compliance that came out in July of this year. This is basically, it's a voluntary tool to facilitate compliance with the AI Act. So for example, on frontier AI models, so this is what we call models with systemic risk, the AI Act says that providers have to assess and mitigate systemic risks. and they have to implement an adequate level of cybersecurity. And now the purpose of the code is to detail out what exactly this means in order that companies can effectively comply. So this was written by independent experts, where we have 3 of them here today. I believe Yoshua Bengio, Rishi Bomazani, and I think Daniel Privitera is here too somewhere, although I can't see him. So yeah, I'll take this opportunity to thank you again for all the work you did over the past year on this. The code has 3 chapters: copyright, transparency, and safety and security. The first 2 chapters apply to general purpose AI models in general, whereas the last chapter, which is also the longest, applies to only frontier models. So this is the biggest models that also pose the biggest risks. The code of practice has been signed by almost all frontier AI labs, which we're very glad about. So it's we consider this a big success. To quickly, go through the individual chapters of the code, I'll focus most on the safety and security part because it's one I know best, and also because it's the longest. So the copyright chapter is about the obligation in the Act for companies to put in place a copyright policy and also to respect measures to respect rights opt-outs, basically. So it details out on a technical level, how companies should respect rights reservations. Then transparency provides a user-friendly template for companies to document information that they're supposed to document according to the AI Act about the model that they can then provide to AI Office and downstream providers and national competent authorities upon request. To move on to the safety and security chapter of the code, the goal here is to assess and mitigate systemic risks. So first, what are systemic risks? Basically, they're the most large-scale risks that can be posed by AI models. I'll give a few examples that are detailed out in the code, but this is not an exhaustive list. So for example, a model that is used by terrorists to build a bioweapon, that would be a systemic risk. Or a model that autonomously is able to escape human control in a way that is potentially unrecoverable. Or a model that is capable enough that it enables automated large-scale cyber attacks in ways that are hard to defend against. So this is really about the larger scale risks that can be posed by AI models. And if we move on to the next slide, I'll quickly cover some of the key points that are mentioned in the safety and security chapter of the code. So first of all, this has been a practice by Frontier Labs for a while now, that they put out frameworks that describe their overarching approach to managing risks from AI models. We call these frameworks safety and security frameworks, and in the code, the code basically integrates this existing practice and details it out a bit further so that it can be used for complying with the AI Act. Companies that commit to the measures in the code need to do risk assessment, including model evaluations. And based on that, they need to come to a determination whether the risk posed by any specific model is acceptable or not. And if not, they need to implement proper mitigations. Key part of this process is also evaluations by independent external evaluators that need to be involved under certain circumstances. And finally, there are also cybersecurity measures. So this is mainly about protecting model weights from being stolen by bad actors, or also self-exfiltration of model weights by the model itself. Thank you very much. I'm very curious and interested to talk to all of you more about the code of practice, especially if there are any disagreements or things that you think we could do better. Very glad to be here. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Lauro. I just want to check whether we have 1 or 2 questions for Lauro before we go into our next panels. If not, we can take questions at the end, but any burning questions out on the floor? Okay.
Thanks a lot, Laura, for this excellent presentation. My name is Casper. I'm from the Netherlands Consulate General. also a bit familiar with EU regulation and code of practice, so it can be very hard. So I hope I ask a simple question. As I understood it, the, um, the AI continent action plan, which was launched in April, that was more or less the promote side. How would you describe more like policy-wise the new Apply AI Act or Apply AI strategy that's coming up? Would that be more a support model, or would it also be a security aspect? Can you elaborate a little bit more on the Apply AI, please? Thanks.
I'm unfortunately not going to be able to give a very useful answer here, mostly because it will come out next week. So there's just not that I can say before that. And also because I'm not part of the team that was working on. So it's also just less of my personal expertise. So apologies for that.
I don't know if you have considered this, but it'd be interesting to discuss the intersection and differences between the Code of Practice and SB 53. I don't know if you have some answers there.
Yeah, I think there's like the Code of Practice is both broader and narrower than SB 53 in different ways. I think one example, and I mean you know this well, but one example is that SB 53 has a provision for public transparency in some ways, which the Code of Practice doesn't really have, just because it wasn't the AI Act doesn't give the legal basis for public transparency. But then in some ways, the measures for risk assessment and mitigation, as you will know, are more detailed in the Code of Practice than in SB 53. So there's quite a bit of overlap, but there's also things that one of them does that the other doesn't.
Good to have hope.
Yeah, it certainly is.
I think we can take one final question at the back, although I will ask you to speak into the mic for our online audience, though. Thank you so much.
So a couple of models have come out after the COP has been implemented. I'm wondering whether you have any learning lessons from the companies or from your personal perspective as the EU.
I can't comment much on any specific model that that came out. I think it's definitely a very interesting period for us, because as these models come out, we need to deal with the fact that the code also doesn't obviously cover in perfect specificity every aspect of safety frameworks, model reports, and evals, and so there are a lot of open questions that we need to answer about what are appropriate evals to run. When is a risk assessment that has been done on a model adequate, and safety mitigations as well. So yeah, I think that's what I can say. There are a lot of open questions. We're working on figuring them out, and we're very interested for having exchange with labs and with other organizations on those topics.
All right, thank you so much, Laura. Please join me in thanking Laura for the presentation. And we are going to welcome up our panel. So if our speakers could kindly join us up on stage, we're going to go ahead and get started. And we also have, for the people standing at the back, 4 extra VIP seats at the front in case anyone would like to be subject to first row line of questioning, or hopefully not. But any takers, please feel free to come up. They are free for the duration of the panel. We are going to share one microphone if that's all right. So I will pass it around. But maybe by way of introduction, my name is Isabel Hahn. I work here at the EU office together with Gerard, Joanna, and our wonderful small but mighty team. I cover AI policy, and I sit with one leg here as part of the EU mission to the US, and with one very long leg in Brussels, where I also sit as part of the AI office together with Lauro and our other colleagues who are working on not only the code of practice, but all of the provisions that are either entering into force or have entered into force under the EU AI Act. So it's been a very interesting and exciting time for us, challenging in many ways as well, and very much looking forward to having a stellar lineup of speakers joining us for the conversation this morning to cover not only topics of governance, but also investment, infrastructure, application layer, and so on. So with that, let me go ahead and get started and introduce our speakers. To my left here, we have Rishi Momasani, who is a senior research scholar at the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered AI, where he researches societal and economic impact of AI. He is also the lead researcher on the annual Stanford Foundation Model Transparency Index, lead author of the California Report on Frontier AI Policy, and was also a vice chair of the EU AI Act's General Purpose AI Code of Practice. Next up, we have Professor Bengio. May I call you Yoshua on the panel? Thank you, Yoshua. Yoshua, in many ways, I'm sure needs no introduction, but for the sake of completeness, he is a full professor of computer science at the Université de Montréal, co-president and scientific director of Law Zero, as well as the founder and scientific advisor of Mila. He's considered one of the world's leaders in AI and deep learning. He's the recipient of the 2018 AM Turing Award, which is considered to be the Nobel Prize of Computing, and was also one of the chairs of the Code of Practice. Next up, we have Dr. Pushkar Apte, who serves as Strategic Technology Advisor for SEMI, the electronics industry consortium representing 2,500 companies worldwide, where he leads SEMI's global smart data AI initiative. So Pushkar previously also worked with Texas Instruments Incorporated on cutting-edge research and technology developments for microelectronics, with McKinsey & Co. as their global semiconductor business expert, and with the Semiconductor Industry Association. And last but definitely not least, we have Paula Goldman joining us here today, who is Salesforce's first ever Chief Ethical and Humane Use Officer and an Executive Vice President of Product. In her role, Paula leads Salesforce to create a framework to build and deploy trustworthy technology with a particular focus on data and AI. And prior to Salesforce, Paula was VP and head of tech at Society Solutions Lab, as well as VP of impact investing at Omidyar Network. So with all of these accolades that we have here on stage, I'm gonna go ahead and start the discussion actually by picking up on where Lauro left off. And Yoshua, the first question will be for you in this regard. Now, we've said multiple times that you served as one of the chairs of the Code of Practice. Now that the code has been published, we're moving towards the implementation stage. What have you observed so far about its early impact? If you could tell us a little bit about that.
So if I go back a few months ago, the chairs and co-chairs had a lot of uncertainty as to what would happen, and there were a lot of potential obstacles, both from inside the EU and outside, that could have led to the Code of Practice not really succeeding in its mission. But yeah, things have turned out incredibly well. Some of the internal political obstacles, things went better than we were hoping. And of course, the most important is we had a lot of positive responses from most of the AI labs. And so that I think has put the AI Act and the Code of Practice, and especially the safety and security part, as a new world standard, really, for reporting on safety and security of frontier models. And it's happened pretty quickly, mostly over the month of August. And I would say that it was possible because of the way that we constructed this through a huge number of dialogues with individual companies, with civil society, with the political class in the EU, and it was difficult to navigate. But this is precisely what Garrett was talking about. It isn't something that's being written, in a room by a committee, but really it is the effort of coordination across many parties with different views, different interests, and I think this can be an example for future drafts of legislation for AI. There's still many things to do to improve, I think, but it's an amazingly good start.
And I'm just going to follow up on that briefly and ask you if you could share a little bit about the global call for AI red lines. This was an initiative that came up 10 days ago or so.
Yes, that I signed. One thing is to have national or regional regulation, and that's very important. But unfortunately, the positive impacts, but also the risks that come with AI, many of them have a global nature, and you can have AIs that are developed in one country and can become a problem in other countries. And so we will not deal with these large-scale risks just at the national level. We have to coordinate internationally. What is the right way of doing this? Of course, it's not clear. In my opinion, we need to move towards a world where the power of AI is both decentralized and coordinated, so that we don't end up with cowboy behavior in some places of the world that are going to affect everyone else.
That's super interesting. I love the phrasing decentralized and coordinated. I think that's really interesting. Rishi, I wanna kick this over to you and ask you a little bit what's happened in California this week. Because, I mean, we had obviously the Code of Practice, which we've heard about. We had the UN General Assembly last week, or 2 weeks ago at this point, where this global call for AI Red Lines initiative was launched, spearheaded by the Future Society. And earlier this week on Monday, we had Governor Newsom sign SB 53. So I wanted to ask you, from your perspective as one of the lead authors of the California AI Frontier Policy Report, what are your thoughts on where we're heading in terms of governance, not only in California, but the way that this is impacting the ecosystem at large at the moment?
Yeah, I think Lauro started us off a little bit in the earlier part of this, talking about the interplay between these two things. I think his characterization of the relationship between what's happening in the EU with the Code of Practice and the AI Act and what's happening in California with SB 53 is pretty apt, in the sense that there is a large sort of resonance thematically in what both think about, and then on the specifics, they deviate some in ways that might be potentially complementary in the best case. So I think it's a signal that, I think more generally we'll see, many jurisdictions beyond the EU also regulate in the AI space. And we should think about how all of those different regulations harmonize, because many of the companies will have to comply in all of these different jurisdictions. I think a separate thing that's interesting to me is whether we can see innovation on compliance, right? We often talk about innovation, as we've talked about earlier today, in the sense of just generally how can we make AI, advance productivity or the like. One thing I feel we don't often talk about as much is, in particular, in complying with these regulations in different jurisdictions, how can we make sure that we maximize efficacy, right? We go through this great labor to write these laws and, as Yasha mentioned, consult many stakeholders and try to integrate all of their feedback. But for the actual implemented policy to have the desired impacts, I think we want to figure out how to strike the balance of making sure compliance is easy, and actually we mainly focus on the substantive benefits we're trying to seek from the policy. So I think in the EU, the thinking is a bit more mature here because the AI Act is older than SB 53. And so one thing I'd also like to see is the staff actually in charge of overseeing these different pieces of policy working together across jurisdictions to figure out how we can most effectively jointly implement all of these different policies.
I'm going to ask you the million-dollar question now, which is, how do you innovate when it comes to compliance? How do you make that evidence-based and effective?
Yeah, I think it's Good question. I mean, I think one thing we tried, I think there's simple things that we can learn from any incidents in the past. So for example, one thing we tried to do in the transparency part of the code is just try to make compliance easy by having these templates that seem to be widely appreciated and the like. I think there are actually other opportunities here where you can think about how AI can be used in compliance, which are maybe worth exploring, because I think if you talk to many of the teams and companies in charge of implementing most of these policies, like the people that work on documentation or safety or whatever in the companies, often in the companies there are capacity limits in terms of these teams are often not very large and maybe smaller than we'd like. And so I think there are other opportunities here where the benefits of reducing compliance costs come through coordination and sharing of learnings, whereas by default, many things happen in many silos. And so I think finding opportunities for breaking those silos, I think would be a good place to start.
Yeah, I very much like that perspective. I think breaking silos is definitely something that is really needed today. I mean, you look at what's happening in California as well, right, with the different sectoral laws that are before Governor Newsom's desk to be signed, I guess, by the end of next week. And so I guess we'll see how that goes in the next couple of months, but I definitely appreciate that message. So with that, I'm going to turn a little bit away from the code of practice and over to Pushkar to ask you a little bit about the more technical side and looking a little bit at the semiconductor industry and the broader compute ecosystem worldwide. What kind of investments are most critical right now to sustain AI innovation, right? There's been investments on this side of the pond, on that side of the pond, hundreds of billions going into data centers, into compute GPU capacity. What are your thoughts on that?
Thanks. I guess I'm kind of the odd man out on the panel. Maybe I'm a deep technical guy, so I'm learning lots of things about policy. So thank you very much. When it comes to AI investments and what they should focus on, my bottom line is that we need to take a thoughtful system level approach. It's interesting that we talked about silos. There are silos on the technical side as well. AI is not one big monolith. It is like a jigsaw puzzle of many pieces that come together. So at the highest level, you have hardware and software. Within software, if you dive deeper, you have the frontier models that we have been talking about, but then also you have specialized software for specific devices, specific applications, and so forth. At the hardware level, you have the foundation of the chips. Then you have the packaging that brings these chips together and the system level integration. We cannot have these innovation things happen in silos. They have to be across the board. And unfortunately, they often do happen in silos. So that is one big thing. You were talking about investment. There's actually a mismatch of the cycle time of return on investment on many of these pieces. So for example, if you build a new greenfield fab, it doesn't return on investment for about 6 years at least. If you build a new chip, that's a little bit shorter than that. If you build a data center, it's even shorter than that. So thoughtful investment needs to take these varying time cycles in mind. On the technical side, there's also time cycle mismatch. Software can be developed within a few months, whereas hardware takes years to develop. So I think those are some of the key things to take in mind. And if we do that thoughtfully, I think in the future, we can build systems that are more resilient and more efficient. And I think that's the direction that investment needs to go.
Okay, so it sounds like not only the governance side is in need of breaking silos, but also the technical side.
Absolutely.
How do you do that on a technical level?
That is $1 billion question. It's more than $1 million. It is hard because, and you know, one of the things that I represent, SEMI, which is an industry association. By the way, I have an updated number on the membership. It's now 3,500. So beyond the 2,500 you said, and that's literally our bread and butter. That's what we do. We bring people together, but it's not easy, because people have the different elements of the value chain have different priorities, different concerns, and often don't speak the same language. they have, if any of you are technical, you know that if you're a software person, design person, process person, they can't talk to each other. They have completely different terminology. So as SEMI and other organizations like us, who we provide a safe, neutral ground where people can interact and thoughtfully bring them together, that helps. But then we need to go beyond just talking to actually doing. And maybe I can come to that later, but I don't want to hog up all the time.
Okay, thank you for that. Paula, I'm going to turn to you as Salesforce has recently announced a, what is it, $6 billion investment into the UK to expand its R&D footprint. So how do you see such large-scale investments shaping this entire governance conversation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I want to say, first of all, thanks for having us today. It's for me, having been working in this space for quite some time, and to see a Friday morning standing room only conversation about this is like just incredible. And I guess what I'll say is, just to give you a little background, take a step back. So Salesforce established 6+ years ago this Office of Ethical and Humane Use. And we had a set of principles, as many do, about what trustworthy AI looks like. And as the generative wave hit, we had to adapt the principles. So, accuracy, for example, was like, on the radar, but all of a sudden it became the #1 principle, right? Because if you're dealing with a new type of AI that can quote unquote hallucinate, all of a sudden you have to change a little bit of the approach to how you deal with it. We have a set of acceptable use policies, one that is unique to AI. I think we were potentially probably the first enterprise company that did that. And most importantly, we work every single day with our AI research team, our product team, and so on. We started, for example, with a trust layer that helps businesses ensure that, AI is not training on their data without their knowledge, that it's generating accurate results, and so on. But then as we moved into agentic AI, we realized that we needed to be building and co-building with our product teams new tools, new testing for businesses so that they knew that they were getting the right results, accurate results, and so on. So just to give you a flavor of what that work looks like. Why do I say that? Because as we think about supporting innovation in Europe, and I should say that that Salesforce has been very proud to be part of the EU AI Pact, to be part of the consultation for the Apply AI strategy, and so on. This is the first time, the last couple of years has been the first time in my career where the question of trust in AI is the first question that businesses ask when they're buying. Right? It used to be that when you thought about AI governance, it really was just about sort of the models or the advanced very domain specific AI applications. All of a sudden, no. Every single business that's using AI is asking, how do I know if I can get trustworthy results? How do I enable my people to apply the right level of diligence, the right level of oversight to know when maybe something doesn't look quite right and to change it, right? And those questions are super critical as we're thinking about scaling innovation, is how do we enable businesses across the EU, not just those that are applying AI or that are building AI, but those that are applying it to use it well. And that's, I think, the complement to what you heard earlier about the code of practice that's really more about kind of advanced models. And to your point, it's about the whole stack. It's about the applications and building in easy human-centric ways for people to know what's going on, to change it, to be in control of the results. And I think, we had a survey that said 63% of people globally, so not just executives, workers, want increased AI literacy, increased AI skills. That is what unlocks innovation within businesses worldwide.
So can I ask you, how has that impacted Salesforce in the last year? How have your practices, with this increased demand for trust, or if that's something that you're, not only investors, but also customers are really becoming vocal about, has this resulted in any shifts in internal business models that you can say?
Well, it's kept me very busy, I'll say that. But I will also say that it means that, internally how we're organized, it means that trustworthy AI has expanded to almost every team, right? So it's our customer, it's not just our product teams, our customer facing teams and so on. But also, interestingly, I wanted to mention, I'm sure all of you have heard this concept of artificial general intelligence. At Salesforce, we talk more about what we call enterprise general intelligence, right? So we talk about businesses not only needing super capable AI, but needing AI that is capable, consistent, and well used by people, right? And that's kind of the focus that we've been in discussion with for all of our customers as we expand and kind of keep in conversation with them.
That's super interesting. Thank you for sharing. I want to pick up a little bit on the points around agentic AI, right? And this entire conversation about agents, which seems to be at the forefront of everybody's mind, both on a governance level, but also on a ooh, this is a little bit of the unknown, and what's this going to end up being, and is this going to actually be something that changes not only the future of the workforce, but also the way that we currently can, make use of these systems that we have before us. And so, Yoshua, I'm going to turn back to you on this question. Now, you were the chair of the International AI Safety Report, which was recently published. And one of the observations that was made in that report was that many companies are now investing in AI agents. But I want to ask you what you think this means for our governance conversations, right? We know that traceability is becoming a greater question. We know that, there are no telemetry standards for agents at this moment in time. Is that something that needs to be developed?
Yes. I remember not so long ago, a lot of people trying to reassure the public about AI. We're talking about, human in the loop. And if you think about a chatbot, it is kind of something with a human in the loop, because you get an answer and then you, the human, do something with it. But of course, with agents, it's a completely different game, where the AI is going to do a sequence of actions without any human oversight. And that could be very, very economically profitable, because you absolutely need that kind of capability in order to do the jobs, the tasks that humans do, and replace labor, automate labor. That's worth a lot of money. So I think that's the reason why we're getting so much investment. However, at a scientific level, and as we discuss in the international report on AI safety, we really don't have the answers as to how we make sure that the intermediate steps that the AI is taking, the intermediate goals, instrumental goals, sub-goals that the AI creates for itself, actually correspond to things we would agree with. And of course, you could say, well, why don't we just put more safety specifications and goals in the queries and the instructions and the pre-prompts and so on? And we do. And you also have reinforcement learning with human feedback and other such methods to try to teach the AI what are the red lines of what is acceptable or not. The problem is that these things don't work. I mean, they don't work with a sufficient level of accuracy, and we do get bad behaviors happening once in a while. So I think there's a need to think about both technical solutions. How do we design AI that will be able to, for example, take safety goals like moral instructions as a hard constraint by opposition to some trade-off with the user demands and those safety goals. We don't know how to do that yet. And when there's a goal conflict, we see the AI is often choosing the wrong side. And we also need governance because there is not enough yet work on how to evaluate those risks, how to monitor those things in the field. And I think that there's something that might be a good sign of this, which is a liability, right? So chatbots are kind of protected under, free expression laws. They can say all kinds of, bad things, but it's up to humans to do something with that. But the agents, that's a different thing. So I expect to see more lawsuits and maybe even the emergence of an insurance market against those liability costs. And I think that might be a good force towards disciplining the developers to try to find technical solutions and put in place safeguards in order to mitigate those risks. But fundamentally, I think like we do need to create more incentives for the companies developing AI to figure out how we can build agents that will be safe and not do dangerous stuff and harm people or other things that are not acceptable.
And I'm wondering if maybe in this context, you can tell us a little bit about your new nonprofit, Law Zero, and this project Scientist AI that you're currently working
So
on.
Law Zero has nothing to do with like legal systems, but it's about Asimov's laws of robotics. The number 0 came late, and it says that the AI should not harm humanity or not act in a way that would yield harm to humanity. And the goal of this nonprofit research organization is precisely to figure out how do we build AI systems, and in particular AI agents, that will be safe, that we will be able to trust for theoretical reasons and through empirical validation. Because as I said, we don't have these answers, and we may need these technical answers quickly. Because if the trends in AI capabilities continue at the current rate, within a few years, few could be 3, 5, 10, we will have systems that are stronger than humans in many ways, and then they could do a lot more harm if we don't know how to control them. So the Scientist AI research project really is about how we design AI systems that can be completely trustworthy in terms of answering questions of the form, is this action dangerous? And what is the probability of some particular kind of harm could be an effect of this action? And then if you had things like this that are not biased by any intention, goals, and so on, you could use them to mitigate the risks of AI agents that we don't know right now how to control. And so this is, if we don't know how to align a system so that it has like the right goals, well, we can build a layer on top, a guardrail, a monitor that will check every input and output, of the system and be able to veto behavior that is not acceptable.
I know you said it's not legal, but as a lawyer, you have piqued my interest precisely around the liability question, actually.
Yeah.
Have you thought about where and how liability would lie with something like Scientist AI if it spat out something that was not entirely accurate?
I think every technology that we put out should be subject to liability if it, if it causes harm. Actually, we do need regulation to make that clear and strong and not, a fuzzy line somewhere. So yeah, and if we continue progressing on laws and regulations, that will create more incentive for companies or academia and nonprofits to find these technical solutions, because there'll be a market pressure for doing it.
Super interesting. Thank you for that. Paula, I'm going to turn to you now because keeping with the topic of agents, what are your thoughts on what's happening now in the governance space, or the lack thereof, in terms of dealing with issues like promoting traceability, actually, but people are concerned about agent orchestration and agents having access to data that they shouldn't, and backdoors. Have you guys been thinking about that? What are your thoughts?
Absolutely, it's crucial. I would say, we are very, very deep in agents. We have a whole line of products called Agentforce, which are everything from AI for customer service to sales and sales coaching and outbound sales and so on. And I will say, figuring out these problems are core to unlocking the innovation potential of these products, because rightly, as Yosha just mentioned, you know, if you're a CIO and you're implementing these products, well, if they're going to go out and give erroneous answers, and you might get, you know, like Air Canada sued for an answer, an inaccurate answer about a refund, you got to be really careful about that, right? And so, so we approach it, you know, much in the way that Yosha was talking about, right? Which is it's kind of a two-step thing. It's what are the sort of technical controls and the product level features that enable people to set up and monitor, right? Observability is super critical, right? So all the tests, the ongoing monitoring, you want to anticipate before you launch it what kinds of questions it's going to get, and we're even launching a tool that helps our customers adversarially test their own products. But then you want to keep it keep AI monitoring the AI, but also part two, train people how to use it well, right? The thing that I would mention that I hear so often, and you picked up on this in your question, was about the data piece of it, right? So imagine you have an AI agent that's helping an insurance company approve claims, right? And then let's say that that agent skips a step in the diligence or references outdated data. Well, sort of part of that answer, part of the controls is about retrieval augmented generation and kind of limiting what data is going into the AI. Part of it is about a broader data infrastructure that allows people to have, you know, businesses to have much more sophisticated governance of the type of data that's going in, so that it's not just about reducing hallucinations anymore with AI agents. It's about companies knowing exactly what data is being used to draw these conclusions and to be able to prove it. And that becomes kind of this new reference standard in the world of AI agents.
So it sounds like with, you know, increased needs like that, there's also an increased, you know, energy supply. And on the technical side, Pushkar, I'm looking at you now. You know, AI agents, models that are becoming larger, there's a huge strain on not only data centers, on energy power grids, as we know. So I wanted to ask you, you know, where do you see the biggest bottleneck here? What should we be paying attention to on the supply chain side?
Well, you already hit it. I think energy going forward is going to be a bottleneck, right? Because as you said, with the agentic and other requirements, the AI proliferation is growing, model sizes are growing, the amount of data sets being accessed is growing, and all of this uses more energy. And there is only a limited amount of power that cities, states, countries can bring online over any given time. Now, we don't want to slow the pace of innovation, so we have to find a way to bend this energy curve. And I would go back to my point about the whole stack, right? I think we need to think about whole stack optimization, because there's lots of innovation for power saving happening in different silos of the stack. You hear about small language models instead of large language models. You hear of new kinds of chips. You kind of hear of new packaging mechanisms. You hear of photonics and all these things. But unless all of these things work together, I don't think you're going to see the moving the needle kind of impact to bend the curve. And I think that's what we are trying to do at SEMI. It's interesting, Erard, you mentioned about good regulation enables good innovation. Similarly, good standards, good ways of working together actually spurs the innovation. It doesn't stifle it. So that's what we're trying to do. But I'll admit that we're a drop in the bucket, right? We're just an industry association. So we really need, for this to be effective at scale, we need a lot more players across the whole spectrum, including governments, companies, and academia to come together, the public-private partnerships that you were talking about.
I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about the 3,500 companies that you have, you know, represented, and how they're thinking about this, and where, you know, some of these touching point, like really pain points are for them, apart from, solving the energy grid situation?
Well, there are, different pain points. So that is
Yeah.
one bottleneck. Another bottleneck, which is not directly related to energy, is that the AI demand is growing, and therefore it requires many more chips. And the chip supply can only come at a certain pace. Why? What is the bottleneck there? It is the cost and cycle time. Setting up a new fab, building a new chip, as I said earlier, takes lots of time. A new fab costs a few $1 billion. R&D in the semiconductor industry cost hundreds of millions of dollars. In 2023, for example, the semiconductor industry invested 20% of its revenue in R&D. That's one of the highest percentages, second only to pharma and biotech. If we want continued growth, that is a bottleneck we have to solve. And one of the things we're doing at SEMI, as an example, is that we have brought together not all 3,500, but a small subset of companies, but representing the whole supply chain to do a proof of concept project, again, with academia, government, and industry coming together to address how AI can actually be applied to semiconductor operations. And interestingly, one of the second level bottlenecks there is about data. In our ecosystem, we don't like to share data because everybody has very proprietary data, understandably so. So finding ways of securely sharing data, which by the way may translate to some other applications as well, is another thing we're looking at. So I think we're kind of, I would say, nibbling away at the problem, but I think again the scale is lacking, and the scale requires many more players to join.
Okay, so Rishi, I'm gonna ask you a hard question again, and I'm sorry, this is the second hard question that I'm asking you, but do bigger, more interconnected systems make governance easier or harder?
Great question. I think in general, complexity makes things hard to govern. Now, we might be talking about two things there. Like we might be talking about the companies themselves becoming larger and hard to govern, and a question about how AI at the market level will be structured, and the complexity that comes about that, or from the models themselves and the models becoming larger and more complex and trained in more complicated ways. In either case, I think there is something to say of the AI industry sort of lacks a certain kind of modularity that I think makes policy reasoning harder. So I think traditionally in policy, we can often think about things in a sort of sector by sector way, and then leverage that specificity to think about things, more concretely and think about trade-offs more concretely. Whereas like much about AI is all entangled, as Pushkar said, across the stack. The models are used across many different sectors. You have this complex web of how all of the different AI companies and governments interface with each other. All of these kind of entanglements make it hard to parse out, how to think about any specific thing. So I think in general, the complexity makes things harder. One thing you sometimes hear though is that, oh, well, maybe it's in some ways easy to think about AI policy because maybe there are only a few major companies or a few things that we need to pay attention to. That to me doesn't really make any sense if we think about the last 2 to 3 decades of technology policy. There are a few big tech companies. That doesn't mean it's necessarily easy for them or others to govern them. So in general, I think that's how I'd lean on that.
Okay, interesting. I want to touch a little bit more on your research now, if that's okay by you. And one of the observations, I guess, that has come out of your work is showing that a lot of these foundation models are remaining relatively opaque, right? So when we're talking about the governance that is needed and, all of this investment and making things work, what do we actually need on the transparency side? Both in terms of foundation models, but also agents and more broadly.
Yeah, so I think one thing that's become clear is that many jurisdictions and many people are thinking about transparency because of these information deficits or information asymmetries. So in the international report Yashio led, there is this phrase about this evidence dilemma that policymakers lack certain kinds of key evidence about certain things. And part of that is a function of transparency from the companies or from other stakeholders in the ecosystem. I think to hone in on two particular areas where I think transparency would be important. One is an area that Yasha alluded to earlier on, which is we have these agents that now go through these very complex multi-step processes to take some particular action or intervene on their environments. For those not familiar, that might produce this really, really long transcript of how the agent gets from whatever its goal was to the actual action. You know, that transcript might be tens of thousands of words. So I think there's one type of transparency that's kind of at more of a technical level of, you know, can we better understand these very complicated transcripts? And for example, probably we'll need to use AI to even understand agent behavior as we're seeing, you know, this massive scale of, you know, what it looks like, right? Like how, you know, it may not be scalable in many ways for humans to oversee the entire complex chain of what agents are doing. A second, at a higher level of abstraction, at the organizational level of abstraction, that I think is important to me has always been the most important area of transparency, where currently we have the greatest opacity based on my own work, is on how AI is being used downstream, right? As we know, these are general purpose models. It's literally in the language of the AI Act, but they are used in some specific ways and some specific distribution over different occupations or sectors or whatever. And, you know, 4 years ago, or I guess 5 years ago, we had, say, GPT-3 from OpenAI, a general purpose model. Since then, in the 5 years since, I think we've learned actually very little about empirically where models use and what sectors, what is the distribution over use cases. And I think that makes it very hard to have sharp conversations about, you know, what this technology's impact is on society.
Paula, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but I do wonder what your thoughts about the entire transparency conversation are, right? Because I think downstream use cases are something that agent force or agent applications across the board at Salesforce are put, you know, to purpose for. So how are you guys thinking about this conversation?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I would say something similar as to what Rishi said, but from a kind of an inverse perspective, which is if you really want to know how AI is being used in different industries, it might make sense not to start with the model, but to start with the applications that are being built on top of the models and look at that as that's becoming increasingly a big way in which AI is deployed. And also, you know, a lot of what gives businesses confidence is the safeguards and the use cases and the data curation that's built around the models, right? And so, so I think that level of transparency, which is sort of aligned with the broader EU regulatory stance, the sort of risk-based approach, looking at not just the models themselves or the cutting-edge technology, but the use cases, and then looking at the use cases one by one and assessing their risk and then assessing how it's being used. It sort of goes, it's aligned with that approach is what I would say.
And do you think that there is a need or a benefit to having companies, you know, publicly disclose what they're doing on transparency, right? Is there a need for some sort of a convergence towards best practices when it comes to transparency, or does a siloed approach work in these circumstances?
So, and again, I think we're getting, maybe there's two different problems to solve, right? So there's the problem of how do I know what cutting edge AI is being used for generically? And then there's the problem of how do we solve the kind of riskiest edge cases that might be unique to financial services or medical AI. And so I'm thinking more about that second problem, right? And in that second problem, yeah, I mean, but I think that gets to be, the questions then become domain specific, right? The questions are not about kind of generic safeguards for AI. They're about when a doctor is making a medical diagnosis, at what point is the error coming from AI versus the doctor's error in interpreting AI and so on. And that's where I think, you know, this is part of what's the the fascinating moment that we're in where, AI could have 5 years ago been sort of viewed as its own distinct thing. Now all of a sudden we're talking about every industry, and and so that's why I think having these more industry specific conversations about safeguards becomes much more important.
Do you think there's a risk of fragmentation at all there across different industries?
What do you mean fragmentation?
Fragmentation in terms of, having industry-specific safeguards, but that also resulting in different approaches that are taken, or overlapping, or even conflicting approaches at times.
I mean, I could see that theoretically being a problem, but right now the center of gravity for everyone's attention, media, scholarship, even I would say in some cases, the regulatory attention is on the models, right? And so I think I'm more worried that we're not really looking at the use cases with enough diligence.
That's super interesting. So you would advocate for looking more at, the sector-specific use cases and making sure that the application layer is
right, which is what the EUA Act does, right?
It does.
So,
I'm glad to hear you say that. No, but I think that's a super valuable contribution and insight, particularly as, we have seen this move towards sweeping approaches that try and, tackle everything and anything, which I guess in one sense of, the approach brings certain legal clarity. That there's something is being approached from a blanket perspective, but I guess from the other end, like you say, definitely makes the details, become more opaque or lost in that conversation.
Maybe just to add one thing, like if you're thinking, let's take the medical space. To be clear, Salesforce does not make tools that create medical diagnoses. So, but if you're looking at kind of breaking that down and trying to get a reasonable set of shared practices about how to do that, that guarantees wellness outcomes and so on, you'd want to look at not only what is going on in the model, you'd want to look at what's going on in the application, and you'd want to look at what's going on in the hospital system that set it up, right? There would be a set of shared responsibilities across that stack. And so I guess I just say that to underline the point that when you start really getting into use cases and beyond kind of the horizontal layer that underpins maybe different industries, that's where you can get specific about those different layers of responsibility. Well, ultimately, I think that's what a mature trust system looks like.
That's super, super fascinating and definitely food for thought. Pushkar, I want to ask if we change and focus, on these very specific application layer circumstances, what does that mean for our current supply chain? Does that change anything in the way that, things are currently constructed?
Very interesting question. As you were saying these things, Paula, I was thinking of those implications. So you picked up on absolutely the right thread there, Isabel. There's good things and bad things. Okay, I wouldn't say bad things, but challenges. The good thing is that when we take this application specificity from the software that you were mentioning all the way to hardware, we can actually build much more energy efficient systems, because you can build systems that are designed to do one thing and not multiple things, and they do that very well. So one of the solutions for better energy efficiency is actually customized and more application specific solutions. That said, we have some challenges in terms of our technology platforms, which are more of these horizontal platforms where we have one particular form of technology that we are building. But the industry is coming up with very interesting innovations to get past that. So for example, I'll just mention one thing, and sorry for being a little extra technical here. You've heard of chips. Well, we're now talking of chiplets, which are baby chips. And the idea is that each one of them is specialized for a particular function. The nice thing is that when you have that kind of specificity, you can mix and match them like you would do in a recipe. And customize them for particular applications. So you kind of, it's not completely mature yet, but you kind of have a technology which gets the best of both worlds, which is that it utilizes the huge investments and the horizontal platforms we have, but then we are able to customize the system solutions for particular end applications. That said, none of this is easy, but there's always a trade-off.
So what I would like to know is is there a name for a recipe if you have multiple chiplets and chips in one bowl together? That was a joke. But no, but
Okay, I was scratching my head on that.
no, but this is really interesting to me because I think now that we're moving, from chips down to chiplets, how are people reacting to that? Is there, we only hear, I guess, or at my level, at the legal/policy level, you hear about the big investments, about data centers, about, GPU capacity, about public compute, but we don't hear so much about, what's happening on the granular technical side of, hey, this is a technology that has the potential to, revolutionize the way that energy is used in sector-specific cases. So is there interest in this different approach with the companies that you deal with?
Absolutely. I mean, there's significant interest, and that actually helps me to bring out one point. When we talk about AI, a lot of conversation is focused on data centers. But AI is not just about data centers. The edge is very important. The devices that work at the edge, right? That's where some of these chiplets come into play. Let's take a very trivial example. There's a sensor that measures the tire pressure on all your cars, and it tells you whether the tire pressure is low or not. That thing can become intelligent. To become intelligent, it needs to become a little subsystem where it has a sensor, it has some analysis, it has some processing power, so forth. You can put together a bunch of little chiplets to form that system. That's just one example. And there's 100 such systems. You were talking about medical applications. There are wearables that people have, all of these things. And I actually think that some of these little systems on the edge are going to become more and more significant. There are some predictions that say that a lot of focus right now is on training these big models. But once they go out, and to your point, into different applications, right? I think the inference part is going to become increasingly important. And that's where some of these systems will have much wider proliferation than even what you're seeing in the data centers. This is why, the efficiency, the resilience, and the bending of the energy curve is so important. But coming back to the chiplet point, that absolutely plays a role in that. Because if you're thinking, let's say, of a chip in your phone, I'm sorry to take a little extra time, but you need a communication chip, which is on a different technology basis. You need a camera chip. You need, all these things come together in your little phone, right? Those are the kinds of things that we do with chips right now, but we could do in even smaller form factors with chiplets. And it's a technology in development. I mean, it is happening, but it's not here widely yet.
Do you see a world in which AI agents are responsible for managing the interplay between these different chiplets and chips and the governance of these technical level devices?
We are certainly applying AI to improve the efficiency of manufacturing for design and so forth. But I'm not privy to all that's going on inside every company. I don't know if anybody's doing what you're asking. And yeah, that's an interesting question. I'll need to ponder that.
So business idea for any founders in the room.
These chips don't have the capability to run really large models. So, it would be a different kind of AI that would run on these smaller. Yes.
Super interesting. Good to know. Yoshua, since you have the mic, I will turn back to you, but I want to ask, often our conversations about governance are so disjointed from our conversations about infrastructure, investment, capability build out. And I think we see that even in the panel that we have with us today, right? We've had a conversation around governance and the code of practice and transparency with Rishi and Yoshua, and bringing in Paula in terms of, how does that work on an application layer and what's important. And then Pushkar's voice has really alluded to that there's a breadth of issues that are perhaps not at the forefront of our governance discussions, and maybe for good reason. But at the same time, I feel like my personal take is that's a conversation that needs bridging, right? The conversation around governance, but also certain investments and the impact that certain investments might have on governance. And so I want to ask for your take on that. Should we be paying attention to governing or looking at the way that certain investments are being made, or the impact that they will have on the ecosystem at large?
Well, that's an interesting question. I was thinking of the other direction.
Okay, what's the other direction?
Well, the other direction is that regulation and other such incentives, maybe insurance, should accelerate and expand research in how to make systems that behave well. You have to, consider, in my field, machine learning research, all my life, I've been working with my colleagues to make AI systems more capable in the sense of having the ability to do more things, to understand more things, to make better predictions, take better decisions, and so on. And that has been the central goal of AI researchers for decades. But when we introduce governance, we're starting to look at different problems that researchers in academia and industry have maybe neglected, which have to do with things like how do we consider the rare cases, the tail behavior. How do we evaluate the uncertainty in the predictions that are made? How do we build systems that are robust to malicious attacks? How do we build systems that don't turn against us? I mean, there's so many questions that are really new to machine learning researchers because they're coming from the how do we protect the public angle, and not how do we build AI that is just smarter and smarter. And yeah, I think that we should see hopefully a lot more of that research, and I do see that change happening in academia. More and more people are interested in these safety questions. The thing that I don't see right now is the incentives really changing significantly the behavior in industry, and it has to do with the kind of market competition, which right now pushes more for capability than for safety. And maybe it's going to take some accidents or events that are going to increase public awareness, force companies to consider that the whole AI market could crumble if there are big setbacks that mean people will not want to use AI, or will have a very different view than what they have now. So I think that by having the appropriate kind of governance at all levels, we can maybe preempt these bad scenarios, and incentivize companies as well as academia to do more research on that front. So in other words, we can stimulate innovation in safety.
I like that. That's a great phrase. We're coming down to the last couple of minutes of our panel, and so I wanted to ask each of you, what is one thing that you are most hopeful about? Whether it's on the governance layer, on the chiplet side, on just generally, and perhaps unexpectedly hopeful about. Maybe we'll start with Rishi.
Yeah, so one thing we haven't exactly talked that much about, but I've been pretty excited about in the last few months because of work from companies and from academia as well, is on understanding how AI is affecting the economy. So there's been a bunch of great work from OpenAI and Anthropic and colleagues at Stanford and several other places on this. And so I think that to me is pretty exciting. And in particular, if there are ways in which we can, really, something Gerard said early on that we haven't talked about is also data sharing. And so if there are ways, for example, in the EU or in the US or in other jurisdictions, for us to share data from private companies to researchers about the economic impacts of AI. I think that will really help accelerate a number of different conversations, both on the innovation front and on the regulation and governance front. And so right now, I think there is a lot of energy around doing this work, and there's a lot of good initial work happening. So I think that excites me.
You have nothing?
Oh, sure. I do actually. On the technical side, the work that I've been doing in my group makes me think that there are technical solutions to address some of the most catastrophic risks, including loss of control, which, I mean, the issue is, are we going to figure it out fast enough? Which depends on the rate of advances in AI. But something related to this is global awareness of catastrophic risks that could come with AI, and there's a diversity of them. The report talks about them. I encourage everyone to read it. We're preparing the next version. It's going to come in February or end of January. It used to be that talking about the possibility of human extinction because of superhuman AI systems that have their own preservation goals was kind of taboo, but that has entered into the global discussion. I'm in discussions with many people in governments around the world, and of course, we don't know. Nobody has a crystal ball, but at least we can now look at a diversity of possible futures, which of course depend on the trajectory of the technology, but also on the trajectory of governance. So, for example, what was going on in the UN recently is showing clearly growing interest from governments around the world for the idea that we need to sit down globally and kind of help each other, because we're all in the same boat. When you look at these most catastrophic risks, we are all in the same boat on this planet. Like, it's not like usual friendly competition that we've seen. It's a different thing when we're looking at risks that could engulf all of us, and that should, as people understand more and more these things, especially in government, I think that this becomes more likely that we put in the right guardrails at a societal level globally.
I think the thing that I'm most hopeful about is from a SEMI perspective, it's good to see the willingness to collaborate on certain big things, like, for example, the energy efficiency that I mentioned, but also for certain applications which everyone agrees are not necessarily competitive, but important for humanity. Like, for example, mitigating natural disasters, mitigating wildfires. How can we apply technology to things like this? Those are the things that people are willing to step up and collaborate on. And to me, that is a very hopeful sign.
Glad I had extra time to think about this. I want to plus one what you just said. I mean, just kind of all of the AI for humanity applications that are coming out, wildfire prevention or advanced medical diagnosis, for sure. Super hopeful. Second, super hopeful. I mean, look at this room. Like, look at the fact that we're having this conversation, that we all care about these issues. This would not have happened 5 years ago. I'm hopeful that all the business leaders I talk to are asking these questions, right? And I think they're kind of an under-tapped voice in this broader governance conversation, because they need AI to be trustworthy for them to be able to use it. And then finally, I think I'm hopeful, and I think about so the kind of broader conversation about so-called vibe coding, right? But the idea that it's easier and easier for people to just use AI and understand AI expands the conversation beyond what is sometimes the domain of narrow technical experts to a broader community of people that can then figure out what the rules are that apply to them. So I'm hopeful about the democratization of this conversation writ large.
Thank you so much. And with that, we are going to close the panel portion of this discussion. So please join me in thanking our wonderful speakers for their contributions. And we're going to move into the Q&A portion of the event. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass this microphone onto the speakers while we run that microphone across the room to question askers. So please put your hands up and somebody from our team will come and pass the mic.
Good morning. Thank you for this insightful conversation. My name is Melanie. I'm with HighSpring. Selfishly, my company does adversarial red teaming. I'd love to hear a little bit about how we're approaching that to meet AI EU Act compliance, but beyond compliance, like, are there going to be potentially sharing of prompt libraries, or like, what are you envisioning for the sharing of safeguard approaches to stress test AI systems?
Great. I think there's a variety of levels at which you could imagine collaboration. It could be on the actual sort of techniques, the abstract, or the actual data to prompt models or jailbreak models or do things like that. Yeah, I think in the code, I mean, this is Yashua's part more than mine, but we tried to encourage those kinds of things happening and sharing across the industry of this kind of thing. I think it's not mandatory, if I recall, under the code for legal basis reasons. But regardless, I think encouraging that would be a great thing, because I think what is clear is that there are lots of ways to elicit harmful behaviors from AI, and the sort of terrain of what we're trying to understand is very vast. And so it seems like a collective effort.
Yeah. I just want to add that there is right now a lot of sharing happening at the level of evaluations, but not so much mitigation. And I think we need to have a push in that direction so that we get to design better mitigation. And if nobody knows what the other people are doing, then it's much harder.
Maybe just to add one thing, that this question is a great segue into the next event that we're going to be hosting on the 16th of October on discussing how European deep tech startups and scale-ups are of great interests, not only to VCs, but also to Europe and Silicon Valley. So we'll take the second question up here.
Hi, I'm Andy with Stanford. I would love to hear, I think mostly from you two, on memory. We have more and more memory features. There are challenges regarding evaluation with memory because this is all private data. We have potentially more persuasion scenarios that are enabled by memory. We have more consumer lock-in and competition concerns around memory. What is forward-looking if these systems start to work a little better? What is the governance response?
I'm curious what Yashua has to say. So.
I don't have much to say. I haven't seen much work in that direction, but it looks like you're working on this. I think that this is one of the axes of the gaps between current systems and humans that is of great interest to companies for obvious reasons and because of the current limitations. And I don't know if you were thinking about that. Of course, the increasing number of retrieval augmented generation approaches changes the game of memory quite significantly, and we see a lot of progress that, at least in the technical papers and in the experience you can have with these systems. But I haven't seen anything. It doesn't mean that there isn't on like thinking about the risks that this entails. So this is a great question.
Hi, I'm Jory Desjardins. I work with a number of early stage startups that are focused on AI. I work with an accelerator in the public and private sector, and we're mostly focused on the downstream impacts of AI, notably on the workforce. And I'm curious to know if any thinking has been done. We're thinking about it a lot, but how are you thinking about the impacts on employment, upskilling, needing to bring the workforce back up with where the technology is taking it?
I think it's a critical question. And I think it's one that requires discernment also, right? Because it's right to be focusing on this question. And there's also been kind of a lot of hype and a lot of doom and gloom about what the impacts might be. And I don't know, like reading the scholarship that's coming out, it seems like we're not there yet, right? And the stance that Salesforce has taken is really about using AI for augmentation and skills building, right? So we have a platform called Trailhead, which does free certifications and upskilling, not just on AI generally, but on AI for specific domains and professions. But what's really interesting to me is the work that we're doing internally as we're adopting AI across every function, and seeing not just a top-down kind of mandate, but the bottom-up, like really understanding where people are seeing value and where they're not seeing value, and where they're able to get the right results and not get the right results, right? So mentioned the kind of past phase of AI where we're in the loop, no longer being necessarily a practical response to the wave of AI agents that can take action autonomously. We have a way of talking about this that we call human at the helm, right? Which is that people are no longer necessarily overseeing every single item, but you still want to make sure that the people that are using AI know how it's going and can alter course, right, if needed. And so it's a whole bunch of interesting work about human AI collaboration that we haven't talked about, but I actually think is going to be super, super critical to the future of AI in business.
So there's a new study that just came out from MIT by Eric Bjornstrom called it's called Canaries in the Coal Mine, and it's about looking at specific sectors of employment where AI is having an effect. So if you look globally, there's no statistically discernible effect right now on unemployment. But if you look at the people in the early 20s, there is a very significant effect that was measured, and just in the US statistics of labor, on the order of like 13% reduction. Now, these are correlations, right? In the study, they tried to remove other factors that could be involved, so as to try to focus on the effect of AI, but it's not a causation demonstration. So it's not a proof, but I think there's some clear empirical evidence that we are going in a direction where in some sectors, for some age groups, we're going to see more and more impact. And I think it would be not good policy or governance to just pretend that everything is going to be all right. Even though nobody has a crystal ball, I think it's such an ominous possibility that we should be preparing for that.
Yeah, maybe to say two things. So I definitely encourage looking at Eric's study, which I think says a lot empirically. On that front, I think one other thing, maybe to just very momentarily put on my academic teaching cap, is one thing I'd really encourage everyone in this room to do is OpenAI recently put out this paper called GDP-Val. It's a very interesting paper where they asked real workers and real jobs with on average 14 years of experience to prompt some language models. What I'd encourage you to do is go and look at the data that they actually use to prompt these models in your profession, whatever your profession is. And I think it's actually very informative about what AI can currently do, because I think there's a large overhang between what people imagine AI can do and how they imagine or they use AI and what AI might be able to do. And so I think it's worth clarifying to yourself whether many of the things you do or at least in scope of consideration for AI. The other thing is in the study Yasha just mentioned from this group, one very important thing is how they got the data. So that data comes from this company, ADP, a payroll company. The point I want to take from that is there is a lot of data in private companies about implicitly or explicitly how AI is affecting the economy. And so I think figuring out ways for that to be accessible to economics researchers would be important for actually getting good empirical economics research to happen.
So my question is, I think this is probably mainly for Pushkar, but I'm interested in everyone's opinions. So we talked a lot about how the EU is, doing all of these things where they're, we're investing in compute build-outs, and I'd be interested if, in your opinions on whether the European Union and also the broader European ecosystem, what are we getting right in terms of investing in compute and the broader compute supply chain, but also particularly if you have takes, what are we doing wrong?
Wow. I honestly don't think I can answer that question because I know like small bits and pieces of the picture, but I don't know all the investments that have been made, especially recently. So I really can't comment on whether it's good or bad, but I certainly know that there are some exciting companies out of Europe that are doing, for example, in semiconductors, one of the big things that we need is to make these tiny dimensions. And the one company that does that is out of the Netherlands. It is called ASML. I mean, there are others, but they are kind of the market leaders. And there are quite a few other semiconductor companies and the strong semiconductor ecosystem. And also, there's always best practices that I think come out of all regions that can be adopted. I mean, to give you one totally random anecdotal example, when I was in Helsinki, I found out that some data centers in Finland, the excess heat is used to heat up homes. And I thought that was so cool, both metaphorically and literally, right? But of course, they can do that because they have district heating. We can't do that in most places in the US because we don't have district heating. We have individual home heating. But things like that, best practices come out of all regions. And I would love to study the European landscape more, but not knowing more details, I cannot directly answer your question.
That's fair. Thanks.
Let me, I mean, I'm not an expert in this, but from the discussions I've had across Europe, there's a lot of political attention on sovereign AI and building, compute infrastructure. Great. But for Europe to be really sovereign in AI, or sovereign in the sense of being able to defend its stake, Europe needs to also invest with much greater ambition on the software side, the development of algorithms, the frontiers. And I feel like right now, there's been a bit of discouragement of, that's it. It's going to be, the American companies or the Chinese companies, they're going to lead, and we're just going to passively observe what's going on and hope for the best. I don't think that's a very good strategy. I think that Europe has what it takes, but the culture right now is one that isn't ready to make, and both in governments and in the people that have money, investors and big companies, is not sufficiently risk-taking, not sufficiently ambitious. The sort of energy that we see here in Silicon Valley, is needed to make these investments. I don't know if it's going to happen, but at least we need to wake up. If Europe wants to stay at the table of the discussion about AI in the future, it has to not just build data centers, but also boost significantly its AI frontier development. There's a focus on the dissemination of current AI, which is, of course, useful. But if the advances in AI continue at the current rate, then it's not going to be sufficient to protect the European economy from foreign companies' potential domination.
Maybe just a quick add-on on the infrastructure side. I mean, all these hundreds of billions of investments that are being announced as part of Stargate, and at the same time, we see the incredible progress that's being made on the technology side. So it does raise a question: is there a risk when you invest all of that money in technology that, like next year, the year after, will be overtaken? Are you going to be left with like stranded assets? People are saying, look, well, it happened in the 90s and there was this like overinvestment in fiber optics, but fiber optics, when it didn't really kind of change so much in terms of the technology. It could be used like 5 years or 10 years later. But if you're like stuck with technology, particularly with these energy constraints, that like when there are a lot better technology on the market, I mean, what about the build out that is happening now? Will it still be useful in 2 or 3 years?
Again, I don't have a crystal ball, but yeah, I think the ROI is a concern. I mentioned it earlier in terms of the cycle times and so forth. I think they need again, I'm not the person making the investments, obviously, but I think they need to be tailored and they need to be more resilient. So, for example, one of the things that I mentioned about the cycle mismatch between the software and the hardware, right? When software changes on a dime, and if you're stuck with assets that are producing hardware that's not optimized for that software, you have a huge problem. So we're looking at some mitigation measures, like trying to figure out, what are some key pieces of the hardware infrastructure that can be somewhat flexible. It's not 100% perfect, but that can be somewhat flexible, that can adapt to changes in software direction, for example. Investing more in energy efficiency always helps. And as far as you were pointing to the fiber optics thing example, right? We say in the technology industry that we are always over-optimistic in the near term and pessimistic in the long term. So I think some of these investments will eventually pay off, but whether that payoff, I know that certainly for some of the shorter investment horizon folks, it's challenging, but for the bigger investment horizon folks, I think it will eventually pay off, but that's just my sort of one guy's semi-educated opinion.
Hi, Anne-Sophie Serret from Everyone AI. And obviously, safety is so important, and I'm incredibly thankful for the work done. And also, 40% of the population is under 25 years old. And so which means their brain are still developing. So my question is, how can we include the safety in the safety, the impact on cognitive and socio-emotional development, which is a very sometimes overlooked topic, and which is very invisible, a risk, but which might have a very big impact on our society?
That's a great question, and I hear and read more and more about this these days. I think it's a valid concern. We need more scientific studies to better understand the phenomenon. That's the starting point. Like, you can't regulate if you don't fully understand or sufficiently understand what is going on. But I've seen, just even around myself, I mean, in my network, psychological effects that I would not have expected. People are starting to use their AIs not just as tools, but as kind of partners, friends, advisors, confidants. And this could have some good impact, but there's a lot of vulnerable people, young people, as you mentioned, and we need to better manage this at a governance level.
I'll just start by saying Everyone AI is doing great work, and you all should check it out because it's really critical work on behalf of children. And I will say my comments are limited to my domain of expertise, which is really AI at work, right? But I'm writing a book on this topic about human-centric AI at work, and I've been going deep into looking at AI coaches to build on Joshua's comments. So this has been kind of one of the most surprising breakout, most common uses of AI, right, is for coaching. And in the workplace, I think the critical question is, do people use AI to avoid the hard conversation or to actually have the hard conversation, right? And you see different companies making different design choices around that. And I think there's a similar set of design choices for AI that is being used for personal advice and so on. And I think that's the broader sort of human AI interaction conversation that we have to have.
Hello. I got a question about something that we talked about earlier, particularly sort of if we're doing the right thing in Europe in terms of the future of compute infrastructure, the chips, kind of taking the right policy approaches there. And then Joshua, you made a comment about also making sure we do that sort of for that middle layer of the stack where the language models are, not kind of see that as a sort of missed opportunity, but still be able to engage on that. Sort of wondering, because when we look at the policy mix for what we do on the infrastructural level is very much sort of trying to bridge the gap from, let's say, applied science to going to markets and being able to sort of mitigate that very long runway that you have to the markets. I'm very keen to kind of see, aside from what Geert also talked about in terms of application, what we can really do for that middle layer. So you talked a little bit about talent, about making capital available, but is there sort of, let's say, a policy instrument that we should really focus on to make sure that that middle layer also thrives? Thank you.
Yeah, there are companies in Europe that are, are struggling and are trying to, approach the frontier, and they don't get the kind of investments that they would get, say, here. And there's, it's really not clear for governments in Europe how to prevent them being bought by American companies and then losing that talent and that expertise. But it is something that needs to be tackled. And I don't know what is the right solution, but if the private sector isn't able to take the risks that are needed here, I think governments need to think of a way to incentivize these investments. I think it is also something that's connected to academia, how to encourage graduates from European universities, for example, to start these companies, to join European companies that are really pushing the frontier so that we have an influx of strong talent. And there's so many great universities in Europe that are training that talent. I think also that Europe should be looking at partnerships with other countries, with particular companies, to try to make that middle layer, as you call it, really strong. And it's not an easy problem, but I think it deserves a lot more attention.
We're going to take two final questions, and I have a question from somebody who's dialed in online from Zoom. So this question is from Carla Lee, Initiatives Lead for Data and AI at the World Economic Forum. And her question is, building on the conversation of agile and innovations for compliance, what role should governments play in encouraging or mandating agile compliance approaches such as regulatory sandbox or policy prototyping? Also, how do we avoid widening the responsible AI compliance divide where only large firms with resources can comply effectively with regulations, leaving SMEs and startups behind?
So first, it is a fallacy that regulation is hurting the SMEs. The regulations that I know, they have been designed specifically to focus on the frontier systems that are large and that require so much capital that we're not talking about small companies anymore. Also, I think in addition to the instruments that were mentioned, I think insurance might be something complementary and more agile than the classical regulation. So what I mean by this is if companies have to buy liability insurance, at least for some types of risks that derive from AI, it will create a kind of feedback loop that's very powerful compared to the regulator, which gives a pass or fail mark to a company. the insurers will give a premium that changes with the risk that are being taken if they do a good job, which means that there's always an incentive for companies to improve on safety because that's going to reduce their premium.
Yeah, maybe let me say two things. So one is I partially agree with Yoshua that I think frontier AI regulation has been designed to minimize burden on small companies, but I think there is other regulation on the books. For example, exactly the things people are looking at on the simplification front in the EU that might actually have effects on small companies. So I think one thing I'd encourage companies to do is to be much more precise about, as Gerard said at the beginning, what the actual regulation is and how do you model the cost and why is the cost large? Because that is a much more productive conversation than the banal, regulation is onerous conversation with no amount of specificity. So that's one point. The second point is, I've been doing some work just trying to understand for different regulation or policy how much AI can help with compliance. And my general sense is that there is actually a good amount of potential there. A lot of this is just sort of documenting things or other types of work where I think people should explore whether AI can do these things in an efficient way.
Hi, my name is Dennis Murphy. I have a question that sort of builds on the chip-to-chiplet type discussion, because there seems to be innovation in the language model space for smaller language models that seem to be good enough for certain types of discrete purposes, and they're also much more, you're able to make them safer through data filtration processes when compared towards larger language models. I'm wondering whether or not you think there's a role in the EU to potentially become a leader in a smaller language model space. Thank you.
Oh, that I don't know, because the general answer is yes. I think every region should have that capability. I think the broader point I was making about the whole stack innovation, right, was that all of these innovations along the stack, including small language models, including chiplets, including photonics and various other things that can be useful in reducing the energy consumption, improving the efficiency, should be on the radar. And when Isabel asked me the question about investments, right, that's what I meant, that smart investments should think about the whole stack. Because when you have optimization within little silos, right, it is not necessarily the best global optimum, to speak very geekily, right? So I think that approach, that system level approach, both to investment and technology, will have a huge payoff. So, and definitely small language models are a piece of it. Another piece at the architecture level is just bringing the memory close to computing, because there's so much data that needs to be moved around that's breaking the current systems. All of these things need to work in concert. So I think that's one element of it, but I would, my whole point was to not focus on only one element, but look at the whole stack.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today, but we will be following up with another Brussels to the Bay on October 16th that will answer a lot of these more technical investment questions in depth. We also have Jillian here today who might be able to answer some more questions in depth. She's at the front. But please join me in thanking our panelists so much for their time. Thank you all for coming, and hope everybody has a good Friday.